I think all of these points were made by this trip. And I'm sure Dr. Kissinger will have come away from it with a deeper understanding of Chinese reasoning on the issues of the day. Whether the Biden administration will listen to him or not is a difficult question to answer, because the United States is in the grip of a sort of political hysteria about China, which impedes rational consideration of alternative approaches.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and I am really happy to speak today for the second time to a very special guest, Ambassador Chas Freeman, who was the US Assistant Secretary of Defense from 1993 to 94. He also served as US Ambassador to Saudi Arabia and was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and he was Nixon's principal interpreter during his 1972 visit to China, which led to the normalization of US-China relations. Ambassador Freeman is intimately familiar with Taiwan, China, Africa, and the Middle East, speaking fluently not only French and Spanish, but also Chinese and Arabic. And he's a scholar too, holding a doctorate in jurisprudence from Harvard University. Ambassador Freeman, thank you very much for joining me again.
Glad to be with you.
Ambassador, let's start with China and US-Chinese relations, because currently a lot of things are happening. So you were there in 1972 when Nixon and Kissinger together were in China, and you interpreted for them. And now Mr. Kissinger, at the age of 100, went again to China. He's not in office, he's not a US official, and he was treated better than most US officials who visited over the past couple of months. What is this visit about? How do you interpret it? And what do you make of it?
I don't think it was officially inspired. I believe this was Dr. Kissinger himself acting on his very deep concern that the United States and China are drifting toward war, and that this would be disastrous for both countries as well as for the world. So I think he went to China to express his concern and to inform himself about how the Chinese see things, because he is, in addition to a gifted practitioner of statecraft, he is a very competent diplomat, and diplomacy rests on listening to other people and understanding their perspective and the reasons for it. I believe he was treated the way he was for several reasons. One is, of course, that the Chinese remember his contribution to the opening of China to the world, to the normalization of relations with the United States. They have great respect for him, both as a statesman and as a diplomat. And they are quite serious when they talk about attending to old friends. This is one reason. Another, I think, frankly, was to demonstrate to the incumbent Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, and others in Washington, that it is possible to have a very fruitful dialogue with China, that China can treat you well, rather than scornfully, providing you meet it halfway. And so this was a bit of a put down, I think, for the current White House team. I think it also was an illustration to Russia that China is, as Lord Palmerston advocated, interested only in its interests. It has no permanent relationships or friends. It only has permanent interests. So I think all of these points were made by this trip. And I'm sure Dr. Kissinger will have come away from it with a deeper understanding of Chinese reasoning on the issues of the day. Whether the Biden administration will listen to him or not is a difficult question to answer, because the United States is in the grip of a sort of political hysteria about China, which impedes rational consideration of alternative approaches.
I remember that last time we talked, you told me that the hysteria in the United States is actually worse now than what you still remember as the last parts of McCarthyism. Is that still true? Or did the hysteria when it comes to China and Russia at least go down a little bit?
There is clearly a backlash to this. I think that is represented by Janet Yellen, the Secretary of the Treasury, and the Secretary of Commerce, Gina Raimondo. Secretary Yellen went to Beijing and tried to persuade the Chinese, somewhat preposterously, that the technology war was not intended to hurt them. I don't think they believe that, but I think her arguments were largely directed at a policy debate that's below the surface in Washington. And I think Ms. Raimondo, who is a very able, thoughtful person, is probably making the same case. The American corporate sector has taken a hard look at some of the protectionist policies that the Trump administration inaugurated and the Biden administration has doubled down on, and they don't like what they see because they believe it will cost them their competitiveness and deprive them of capital by depriving them of one of their major markets, which is China. And I think they also are apprehensive that in time China will succeed in duplicating or their technology or producing alternative technologies that accomplish the same thing. And that therefore these policies, which are intended to sustain an American lead in competitiveness, will have exactly the opposite effect. That is the concern, I believe. But the politics of this remain poisonous. We are entering a presidential election cycle with now multiple candidates on the Republican side, only one contestant arrayed against Mr. Biden on the Democratic side. That's RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and a huge effort is being made to disparage him and damage his reputation and portray him as an irrational conspiracy theorist, which he's not. This is the Biden administration. I'm sorry, the style of American politics these days is attack, smear, disparage, discredit, rather than put forward your own better ideas and run on a positive agenda.
And when it comes to the upcoming elections, the thing that worries me most that it seems that there's really only one issue where you have bipartisan agreement, which is China is the enemy of the future, and everybody is trying to say, like, okay, how can I be tough on China? I am very, very worried that the US-China relationship will end up in a war, and it will be a war in and about Taiwan, and that Taiwan could become a second Ukraine. Now, on the other hand, Taiwan has way more capacity as a state, right, than like compared to Ukraine, way less corruption, and it is over 100 years old, 111 years old, this bureaucracy. You who knows both Taipei and Beijing, do you put any hope in the fact that these two might be able to work it out, and that maybe the influence from the US would be less strong than in the case of Ukraine, or how do you see that?
I think at the moment there is impasse, and that has to do with identity politics in Taiwan, which the United States has inadvertently aided and abetted. Every time we make an arms sale or the Speaker of the House has a meeting with the Taiwanese leader, people in Taiwan, some people in Taiwan, take that as an invitation to press for more official recognition by the United States and the international community, and to do things which outrage and infuriate Beijing and contradict the idea of a single Chinese nation, however many polities there may be within that nation. There's one China internationally, and Taiwan, maybe it is, in fact, a very, very robust democracy with a high standard of civil liberties and the rule of law, admirable in many, many respects, but it is still Chinese, and that cannot be easily cast aside. So left to their own devices at the moment, they will not make up. And that, of course, is part of Beijing's dilemma. If there is no path to a negotiated solution for the status of Taiwan in relation to the rest of China, then the only alternative is the use of force. And the United States inadvertently, again, plays into this by adopting an approach which is diplomacy-free and reliant entirely on military deterrence. Military deterrence, in the case of Taiwan, is seen by China as foreign interference in the Chinese Civil War, and rather than deterring, it provokes an arms race and reactions. Now, I think there is sensitivity in Taiwan growing to some of these dilemmas. And I know that Tsai Ing-wen, the president in Taipei, apparently did take the initiative to turn Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House, away from a visit to Taiwan and to try to arrange something that she hoped would be less provocative in California. I'm not sure it was less provocative, but at least she made an effort to reduce the level of provocation as she saw it. And of course, in the end, whether Beijing is provoked or not is determined by Beijing, not by Taipei or Washington. And whether there will be a war over Taiwan or not will be determined by Beijing's reaction to policy changes in Washington and in Taipei. Now, we're coming up on an election in Taipei in early 2024. The leading candidate at the moment, 𝗟𝗂𝘂𝗂𝘁𝗂, who's the current vice president, is judged by Beijing to be a dyed-in-the-wool independence advocate. His election would be a moment of crisis in the Taiwan Strait. What Beijing would do if he were to win, I don't know, but he's also got a problem in Washington because he made it clear that if he won, he would expect to visit the White House, which is totally inconsistent with even the minimal remainders of one China policy that the United States adheres to. So there's an effort being made, I gather, to persuade him that that is not something he should aspire to do.
I have quite a few friends in Taiwan, and all of them agree that the worst thing to happen would be a war. Even being absorbed by China would not be as bad as a war. So there is no appetite, and I think we also see that from the opinion polls, for a war with China. I mean, China is Taiwan's largest trade partner. These two are geographically and historically interlinked as closely as Ukraine and Russia. So do you think that there is a way that maybe a third party could mediate something? I mean, Japan has zero interest in a war between China and Taiwan. It's a worst case scenario for Japan. Do you put any hope into Japanese diplomacy? I'm not really, but maybe you do.
No, I think Japan is not the party to mediate this. If anyone were able to do that, it would be a disinterested party favorable to both sides, like Singapore. But Japan has a history in Taiwan which begins with its occupation of the Taidong area in the 1870s, it had to be pried out of there by an American diplomat, actually, whom the Qing government in Beijing hired to negotiate with Japan. They ended up paying $15 million for the Japanese to vacate the area that they had occupied. And by the way, they didn't just occupy it, they killed everybody in the local tribe, down to the dogs and chickens, on the grounds that when a Japanese freighter went aground there, the local inhabitants had eaten the crew. So this was the habit of the indigenous non-Han population there. So that began a relationship between Beijing and Tokyo, which is unfortunate. And it became more unfortunate in 1895 when Japan annexed Taiwan and occupied it, the Japanese Navy managing it until 1945. The first 20 years of that period, by the way, were full of violent insurrections by Taiwanese. There were also problems with the Aboriginal inhabitants, many of whom were gassed, nerve gas, from aircraft by the Japanese Navy. But sometime around the late mid-1920s, going into the 1930s, the Navy had succeeded in persuading Taiwanese to assimilate to Japan. And when, in 1945, when troops from 𝗟𝗂𝘂𝗁 Republic of China retreated from the mainland to Taiwan, they found a population whose intellectuals were far more comfortable discussing things in Japanese, who read Japanese newspapers, who lived in Japanese-style houses on tatami, and who ate Japanese food, which most Chinese regarded as horrifying. And I think these troops who came, most of whom were peasants who had been rounded up and conscripted, treated the Taiwanese with all of the affection that they had for the Japanese after some 25 to 30 million Chinese had died in the 1931 to 1945 war on the mainland. So Japan is not in a position to mediate, even if it wanted to. And I think Japan is appropriately cautious. I note that Japan has not made a commitment of any sort to military intervention in the event of war over Taiwan. It clearly has a major strategic interest in the status of Taiwan, but it has not threatened the use of force. And I think that is wise on the part of the Japanese. So if we are to see a mediation, it will have to be from somewhere else. The United States can't mediate because we are a party to the dispute. And I don't think we're in a mood to do anything anyway. We're in a very ideological moment with the Biden administration insisting that global affairs are organized around two confrontations, one between democracy and authoritarianism, and one which is an ideological stance, and the other over great power rivalry. I don't believe either is an effective explanation for what is happening in the world, but that is what the administration insists.